Hi class. We're going to look at the demand for health and medical care in chapter 5. Looking at it historically, it has grown significantly over the past 100 years or so. People used to spend more money in things like food, clothing, shelter, but now people spend more money in healthcare. So there's been a shift in consumption from things like essentials like food and clothing to healthcare. And the reason for that is there are multiple reasons for that, and we're going to look at those reasons. And we should not be shocked about the increase in spending in healthcare, since we've talked about before about the elasticity of demand, and we've seen that even though there are different studies and that show different numbers, we do believe there is some elasticity, meaning people do react to changes in income and changes in price when it comes to healthcare. So we have higher incomes than ever before, so we should expect higher demand for healthcare and medical care. At this rate, if the elasticity is 1.6, as we have here, and that's one number, we will see the spending in healthcare to get to $30 trillion by 2030, and that's very significant, because that means that we would go from approximately 19-20% around now, where about 19-20% of our GDP is being spent in healthcare, to 23%, and every 1% is very significant, but obviously the higher it gets, the more significant it is. Is this sustainable? Well, it depends how you look at it. I don't think it is. What matters is the question, whether you agree or not with the question, that is with the answer, if it's sustainable or not. What you should think about is like, well, if you think this is sustainable, what are you willing to give up to sustain it? Because it's not sustainable without any sacrifices. You need to give something up to get that type of that level of healthcare. So that's really a more important question. And we assume in economics, that healthcare is just like any other good or service. There is a demand for it, therefore there is a function for it, a mathematical function for it, meaning the output, the amount demanded is a function. It must be based on certain things, and those things are the medical care that is available and other inputs, time, money, technology, needs, etc., etc., etc. So healthcare is the demand for healthcare is a function of multiple things, and those things we're going to look at some of them, but those things are key to answer most of these questions. And as we look at those inputs, those things that go into the function, you need to think, well, can I just keep putting more of those things into my formula to get more output? And the answer is no. We have something called the law of diminishing returns, meaning the increase in the total output decreases as you add more and more of the inputs, because every time you add an input, the last input you add to the formula, that is not as efficient, it does not produce as much as the previous one. So you can imagine at some point, you keep adding, healthcare keeps increasing in amounts, but at some point you keep adding and you're not getting that much. You get a little bit more healthcare. And then at some point, you add more inputs and you don't get more healthcare. You get no healthcare at all. And eventually, after some point on that chart, right? Because I'm imagining a chart, right? As you should by now, you should be imagining your charts. At some point, you keep adding even more input, and the production starts to go down, which is kind of weird, but it's true. And to explain that phenomena, I always like the example of a little pizza place, and you open the pizza place, right? And you have no production. there's nothing. But what is pizza a function of? Well, pizza will be a function of, okay, you're gonna need someone to make the pizza, make the dough, put the toppings and all that stuff. And then you're gonna need pepperoni, cheese, flour, etc. to make the dough, right? So those are all the things that are gonna go into the production of pizza. So you hire one individual and you buy 10 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of pepperoni, 10 pounds of cheese, 10 pounds of, of everything. And your production goes up a lot, right away. Because now you have someone to make pizzas. You went from zero to nothing. And so then you add more flour, you buy more pepperoni, etc., and your production goes up again. Obviously it's going to increase. However, you got to realize that the individual that you hire, well, that individual cannot make pizza fast enough. It's only one person, right? But this individual can make more pizza for sure, just not as fast and as productive as with the first pizza. And you keep adding more, right? And eventually it gets to the point where the individual is like, hey, look, I only work 8 hours, right? Let's say I only work 8 hours. There's a maximum amount of pizzas that I can make. It doesn't matter that you give me more pizzas. I'm sorry, you give me more flour and toppings and etc. I cannot make more pizza. And you're like, oh, I understand. I need to add another worker. That's the problem. I have a lot of the other stuff. Okay, so you hire a second worker. Oh, production goes up significantly, right? It goes up like you wouldn't believe. Great. Now you're making even more pizzas. So you buy more flour, you buy more pepperoni and cheese, etc. And eventually you have the same problem. Each of those workers can only make certain amount of pizzas. They're capped at some level. They can't make more pizza. So you're like, oh, okay, no problem. I reached that plateau, that the flat part of the curve, no problem. Let me hire a third worker, a fourth worker, a fifth worker. But eventually, all of these workers in the same pizza place, they start to bump into each other. There is not enough room. They're knocking each other off. The pizzas don't fit in the oven. There's like waiting to, you have people that are waiting with their dough and everything ready to go into the oven, but they can't go in because there's another pizza in there. The oven is full. Again, they bump into each other. So they're now keeping the other workers from doing their work. Bottom line, the production starts to go down compared to the previous period. Not compared to maybe 4, 5, 6 periods before, but compared to the previous period, now the production starts to go down. So eventually you do get to that point. So again, you have the law of diminishing returns tells you that yes, production is going to go up, but at a decreasing rate. Eventually it's going to flatten, and past that point, you may go into a decreasing, a negative production. And this is how it will look like. So you have your total production curve, right? And at some level, right? This is medical. So forget about pizzas now. We're not talking about pizzas anymore. We're talking about medical care spending and health status. So here's the spending, right? The more spending, the higher the health status because you're providing more and more health. But it keeps you keep adding health status, healthcare, at a decreasing rate. You see how it's going up, but it's not going up as much as the previous unit. And at some point, it reaches a plateau. And eventually, it starts to go down. If we look at the marginal, at the bottom, the marginal change in health status, which you can interpret as the slope of that line, you see that as medical care spending increases, the marginal change in health status, that is the addition of health status to your total production, goes down, right? So this will be the slope of this line. So you're adding less and less and less, and eventually, when it gets to this point, you're not adding anything at all, nothing, zero. That point, if you draw a line straight up to the upper curve, that hits that total production curve right at the flat spot, where more medical care spending does not bring more health status. That's the law of diminishing returns. So, does too much medical care exist? Yes, it does. There is such thing as too much medical care. We actually have a term named the iatrogenic disease, which is the result of it is the result of less health status, right? Of poor levels of health quality when too much or incorrect care is provided. So at some point, you get too much care or the wrong care, and that decreases your health status. That's what we call the iatrogenic disease, and you can pronounce that whichever way you want to, because I think I've heard three different pronunciations of that word. I probably pronounce it differently every time. And in some cases, it might be a little bit different to a bit strange, a bit difficult to spot, because, for example, is prolonging someone's life, is that in certain cases, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It could be a bad thing. If prolonging life means prolonging suffering, that could actually be too much care. And that's up for debate. I'm sure we could debate over that for hours and hours. A more clear example would be the one that you all know. Having too many X-rays will expose you to harmful radiation that would eventually probably end up in you developing some type of cancer. So those are examples. And I don't know about you, but I have experienced it and I have seen it. Perhaps too many X-rays being done by doctors. According to some studies, specifically one study, around 4%, just to give you an idea of the magnitude, around 4% of all hospitalizations see some type of adverse outcome. And you're thinking, well, a second, that doesn't have to be because there was too much care given. Well, it's kind of like the whole thing is either too much care or the incorrect care. It's all the different things that that could happen, and clearly we don't want to think about this. But doctors, nurses, the medical profession, they are not gods. They're not always right. They are incredibly good at what they do, but sometimes they do make mistakes, and that's something that we need to understand. And I respect them a lot. Trust me, I am not criticizing them. I actually have huge respect for what they do. But they need to be reminded, and we need to be reminded that they're not gods on earth. And finally, even if we agree to all of this, like yes, eventually too much care, yes, that could be harmful. Where we're going to have an interesting debate would be like, okay, but what's too much? What is that level? At what point we say, okay, that's enough care? So we need to measure that. So we need to measure the care, the quality, which we've done in chapter 4. But consumers need to understand that as well, and they shouldn't demand beyond that point. And as we know, sometimes they do. So if we believe there is a point where there's too much care because we're not bringing more health status, then how would we define good health? At what point do we stop? And there are different definitions, but here we have the definition by the World Health Organization, which is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So in this case, this has been expanded, of course, over the years to include the concept of, is right towards the end, the concept of mental health and disease presence, right? So it's not just that you can walk. There's more to what good health means. And that's why you will see so much focus these days on mental health. Some of the measures we see around the world are the two typical, which are mortality, which is usually given as the death rate for a given population measured per 100,000. And morbidity, which is the incidence of illness, right? Is the existence of illness, is people that have an illness, and of course that illness brings other conditions, and et cetera, et cetera. And those conditions, of course, will bring a decrease in the quality of life, restrictions on how active a person is, how productive that person is, etc. And finally, we have measures of quality of life, like, for example, QALYS, which we've seen in Chapter 4. If we look at the top 10 causes of death, 1980 to 2010, we see that there's not that much change. You can see that there's heart disease right there. Most of them are still there, but there's been a few changes. But the most interesting change to me is actually that while all of them, and again some of them have dropped off, all of them have fallen in terms of the mortality rate, except suicide and unintentional death, accidents. So those are number 4 and number 10 here, right? If you notice, they're still right around the same spot, right? In 2010 they were number 4. 1980s it was number 4. 2010 is number 5, and suicide was 10 and 10 on both periods. But if you look at the mortality rate is slightly it's higher. It's much higher. I think it's much higher. And to be honest, I think it's considerably higher. And that indicates to me, right, that this suicide and this unintentional injuries, this has to do with some of the things that I said before. This is linking to the whole idea of lifestyles. In the U.S., and around the world, but especially in the U.S., we have a significant change of lifestyle in the past 20, 30 years that is driving both spending in healthcare and mortality and morbidity. Okay, just keep that in mind. And I don't think that's something that the book mentions, but I don't think the book really, really highlights as much as I think it should. Oh, sorry. Another way to measure health status is the amount of work days lost due to morbidity, due to the fact that people are sick and they can't get to work, or they're working at a level that is not optimal. And there you are, you see all the different rates. And overall, there's been not that many changes. There are a few changes, but if you think about it, and I'm going to let you do this, I'm not going to do it probably because I don't want to get too controversial here, but you're going to find that some of them are really tied to lifestyles. These are things that we didn't have a problem with this before, and by before I mean maybe 50, 60 years ago. These are things that we are causing to ourselves because of our choices. So what are the determinants of health status? Medical care alone is not the only contributor to your health. Just because, just having access to a prescription or a treatment doesn't determine your health status. Health status is tied to many other things. It's tied to income, to education, to environmental things around you. That also includes the environment. I mean, I'm talking about the air and things of that nature, but I'm also talking about what's around you. Where do you live? Who's around you? What kind of neighborhood do you live in? It matters. And there's also a thing, genetics, right? It does matter. We know that some races are particularly more exposed to certain diseases than others. We know that others that are known to be much healthier, like the Japanese and so on. They we know that they have their genetics are I don't know what the word is, but we know that they don't seem to react the same way as others do to certain conditions. And going back to the environmental reasons, social class determines your health in many cases, or it doesn't determine it, but it sure affects it. I guess that I can argue that I can't. It would be hard to argue not very hard, but it will be hard to argue that it determines it, but it sure is easy to argue that social class drives health status. I think that is very easy to prove. And we see here just an interesting point here that the lower the grade level of an employee group, the higher the mortality rate for most major causes of death. And that's something that we know in the insurance industry. We know, looking at the type of employer, the type of account, right, our customer, the type of work that they do, we know right away, without even knowing who works for them, we know what the health status is. We know what the issues are going to be. We can predict healthcare spending just knowing what type of job, what type of workers they have. And continuing with this idea that healthcare is not the only driver of health status, public health and nutrition, it's key. We have the decline that we've seen in mortality in Europe and North America, as well as many other countries, of course, comes from things like living standards, better nutrition, housing. Just we now live in homes that are far healthier than what we used to live 50, 60 years ago, especially when it comes to sanitary conditions, right? Water purification, the sewage, the how close we are to trash and to dirt, and etc. How clean things are. We clean things better than ever before. So we get rid of germs and so on from surfaces that we used to be exposed to, especially when it comes to certain foods. So that has caused a decline in some diseases. And of course, the preventive care is probably the best care, and there's been a lot of advances in preventive care with improvements in immunization and so on that keeps us from needing to demand treatments because we were vaccinated at one point. Also, pediatric care, right? Taking care of individuals from a very early age. It's a great investment because it's going to keep us from bigger issues later on. Taking a look at some of these demographics and gender and race, we know there are differences. This is absolutely true, right? We know the data shows that there are huge differences in how these diseases affect different parts of our population. What is debatable and interesting is what the causes are, like what drives what and how to fix it. But the problem exists.